Reference checks can feel like a check the box activity, and they're probably important, but who should you call? What should you ask them? What questions are going to give genuine insights rather than, she's a great gal? Uh, Exploration of this is coming up now. And of course, this is the HR Hub. I'm Andrea Adams. Keep listening to learn about this and anything related to HR. You can also find me on YouTube. And today, my amazing guest is James Lord. James is a reference check expert, and that's by virtue of having worked at a number of reference check companies and in the talent industry for quite a long time. And I think, based on our last conversation and all the other times I've talked to him, that you are going to be impressed by what you learn. Hi, James. How are you?
I'm great, Andrea. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, well, thanks for coming on. So I want to stick to the details. We did big picture last time, fairly big picture. And I want to stick to the details and give people some, practical tips on this one. So I'm going to start, I guess still high level. Can you walk us through what your ideal reference check process would be from start to finish?
So I think really depends, obviously.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think it depends on level of seniority,
Okay.
whether or not these reference checks will just confirm the decision or impacts the hiring outcome, because that's really important. I think also you probably want to think about risks around the candidate and what access they've got information, or what information they've got access to rather. So lots of different things, but what would an ideal process look like for me? Well, again, if I was hiring someone on my team, which I do from time to time, I think what one of the things that I start to do is I make it very apparent to the candidate. I'm very clear and very upfront, like, hey, this is the steps in our process, right? And I would probably explain that even once the application was successful on submission. Right. So we all know that we should communicate more with candidates because candidates apply with their resume and they go into these black holes. So clear and upfront communication with the candidate about what your expectations from them are is super important. But I think references kind of allows you to, for the candidates to kind of show their cards, because the candidate's going to keep their cards close to their chest, right?
Mm-hmm.
I might be, me personally, just, in my personal life, right? In the last decade, I've probably only got about 3, maybe 4 people that can actually vouch for me and my skills and my
Mm-hmm.
experience. So I'm going to keep those people close to my chest. I'm only going to show that hand when I know that there's either a conditional offer on the table or that has been clearly explained to me at the start of the process. And I am very aware that I have to give references as part of the hiring process for this organization or for this role. So clear communication is super, super simple. But what will that look like? So maybe you've submitted your resume, maybe you've done an online interview, like a Zoom interview or something like that, or maybe you've used a third party interview platform, of which there's many great ones right now. You would maybe do an assessment. You would maybe
Mm-hmm.
look at sort of assessment provider, and that's
Mm-hmm.
actually where RefApp bases all of our evidence-based questions on the big 5 personality traits that we get from assessment providers. So that's what everything's all branched down from. When we are asking those questions, I think I would say to someone like, hey, you've got a first formal, informal telephone kind of
Mm-hmm.
interview, hiring manager or with HR, sorry, or maybe a talent person if they've got one. And then once you've done a formal interview, I personally advocate, again, depending on the level of role, like in academia, in schools, colleges, and universities here in North America, it's oftentimes a prerequisite to provide your references on application, right up,
Mm-hmm.
specifically some like faculty roles. But so it's a prerequisite. You already know that going in. So I think you just need to make it really very clear, like, hey, we're going to need your references at X part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And the referencing process looks like this. You will shortly receive an email from refapp.com. You're going to click,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to add the contact details of whatever it says on there, which is usually 2 or 3 references within the
Mm-hmm.
last 5 years, must be from a supervisory or managerial capacity. and then you're away, right?
Mhm.
And the system should be sophisticated enough to have like a check in there. If a fictitious email is entered, it will flag
Mm.
it to the candidate and say, hey, you might want to check this before you proceed. It looks like there's either a typo in it or the candidate's just trying to make it up. So that is what I would say. And then, the questions off the back of that are obviously really important. The
Mhm.
same, a lot of information from the candidate's references, but we don't want to overwhelm people. There's a
Yeah.
balance.
We'll get to the questions in a moment, but I want to dwell on who. So, in this situation, like who we asked the candidate to give us his references, everybody knows, and I think this is one of the biggest criticisms of reference checks is that they're just going to provide the people who like them. How do we how do we really find out the truth about a person when they're just giving their friends?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of different ways. I would say that it's on us as the hiring organization and or the reference platform that you're using to put in place what I call criteria. So you have to define what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So, just off the cuff here, it would probably be something like supervisor or manager from
Hmm.
your last two roles. You must have been a direct reportee of that individual,
Hmm.
and the address that it comes from must be an at organization.com or at company.com. We've
Hmm.
all got Gmail accounts, obviously, but sometimes we struggle to understand the validity of like a social email address, Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo. So I think that's a really basic example, but yeah, we need to make it easy for them.
Hmm. Uh,
And then we need intelligent systems that can actually check things like IP address, device, browser, geolocation, so that I can ensure that the candidate is not the reference providing a reference on themselves sat in their own basement or in their own backyard. Because that happens all the time. Fun fact, 8% of references globally are fraud. I don't want to use the word fraudulent because it's too like, it's a bit of an allegation, but suspicious. Suspicious in nature, 8%. So nearly 1 in 10 people that provide a reference check is probably the candidate providing it on themselves.
so you do say, like, we do let the applicant pick who they're going to offer up as a reference. We just are very specific about who that should be. And I think you should, like, say, for example, it should be the leaders of your last two positions. Well, sometimes it was a poor relationship, so you had to leave that relationship, and that's totally fair. How do we deal with that sort of situation when the person being reference checked doesn't want to offer up their last two supervisors because of one of those they just didn't get along?
Yeah, and that there's always going to be edge cases, right? There always will be. I think that's where we have to then work with a provider that can use, common sense. But common sense is not common, apparently. But that's where you can then add in like an additional provider or an additional reference because of this. So the candidate might even be able to enter an explanation. Hey, I can't provide this reference because of X, Y, or Z. But here's someone else who would vouch for this particular role. You know,
Mhm.
times in scenarios like that, we might want to get someone from internally in the organization. And specifically, if it's like time based references, which oftentimes are a requirement in certain industries. And what I mean by that is that some people just ask for a numeric, like 2, 3, or 4 references. Others say, hey, I don't care how many jobs you've had. I want all of your references for the last 10 years. And if you're an IT contractor and you've only averaged a 6-month contract, that's 20 references right there, right? So, straight away that becomes difficult. But then in scenarios like that, I would be asking for a reference that covers the same period of time that you can't provide that manager because you had a dispute with that individual or whatever. But I would be asking for a character reference to back that particular part up of your profile.
Mm. Mhm. So somebody applies for a job, they have a job, they've worked in that job for the last 10 years. How can you get decent references out of that person?
Right. So when are you asking them to provide references? If you're asking them to provide references on application level, then that's definitely going to they're not going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to provide that reference then. So we have to think about the timing of the request. So we have to think about the sensitivity of the timing, right? So when we're sending that request to the candidate, we might want to wait until they've handed their notice in, or until they've got a conditional offer of employment, or if they are um actually that's it. I'd say before they've actually handed their notice in or got conditional offer of employment, or we have a delay. So we say, hey, this is my reference provider, but I'll get you all the other references from the rest of my resume here from entries 2, 3, 4, and 5, but I'm not going to get you entry 1 reference right now until you give me an offer. Kind of like, you show me yours, I'll show you mine, kind of thing, right? So
Mhm,
give me a job offer, you make me proceed in
mhm,
this process, and then I'll give you my final, most common current employer. So the platform that you're working with should be able to delay those requests if it's a good platform.
So let's think about the actual reference check themselves and the kind of questions RefApp
RefApp, yeah.
is, asking on reference checks. What questions, whether we use an app or not, should we be asking?
The most obvious one that I always say, my favorite question, would you rehire this person and why?
Yes.
We'll expand
Yes.
on that. But I think it has to be related to the individual role. This is where intelligence comes through, because if it was an administrator, you want, or someone that was working in, a financial administrator, for example, you want someone that's got high attention to detail. You want someone that's very analytical. You want someone that's like a problem solver and is very process driven. You don't want someone who's a big blue sky thinker, who's a great salesperson, but they're actually terrible at a spreadsheet. They don't know what a
Mhm,
pivot table is, even if it hit them in the face, right? So you've got to you've got to ask questions that are appropriate for the role. And the
mhm,
reality is, we in HR don't know the best questions. We need to work with an expert team who do and can give us
mhm,
guidance based on data and benchmarks of, like, okay, so I'm a bank. What do my other competitor banks ask for this same person that I'm hiring? You don't
mhm,
have to reinvent the wheel. That's
mhm,
the nice thing.
mhm. Okay. Are there any questions that, okay, so for those of us who do reference checks manually, pick up the phone and call the person, what questions should we be asking that we might or probably aren't asking?
Yeah, I mean, can you tell me a time when? Can you tell me about this? I think that those open-ended questions, especially if you are fortunate enough to get someone on the telephone and they're fortunate enough to be gracious with their time and actually be genuinely helpful in terms of allowing you to learn more information about that individual, I'd be I would always be asking open-ended questions,
Mhm,
and then I would have follow-ups off the back of that. So almost kind of like map it out in your mind. So if they say X, then I'll ask why. If they say
mhm,
this, then I'm going to say that. So you've kind of got like a mental map if you were doing it that way.
mhm,
I think, again, there's a lot of risk in doing telephone-based references, mainly because you don't know who you're speaking to, and there's no record of it. You know,
mhm,
that is really it in a succinktest format, because I haven't actually got a clue that this person on the other end of the phone who says they're James is actually James, and
mhm,
where was the record of that conversation. But that being said, I do, value the spoken word as well.
mhm,
So I think
mhm,
there's a balance there. But if you can have that spoken word with a platform that allows you to either, upload the transcript from that conversation, so there's proof of it, into their platform, and then you've got the audit trail, it's in your HRIS or it's in your ATS, um, or you're working on structured questions that you've really thought about that are specific to the role.
mhm, mhm. Uh, you've alluded to this a number of times. You're like a big advocate for technology. So I think when I ask the question, how should we be conducting reference checks? You'll say use a technology.
Yes.
Why are they better?
Yeah, I mean, as we're all about to witness in this AI revolution that we're all in right now, um, technology is oftentimes faultless. It's it doesn't discriminate when it sends you an email. It's going to send you the email at you might be eating your Thanksgiving turkey. It will send you an email, right?
Mhm,
If that's when you've requested the references. I think technology can just work so much harder than we can, and it's not emotional. We're
mm,
emotional beings as humans.
mhm.
We might be having a bad day, and we might take that out on the person that we're speaking with.
Yeah, take
irrelevant.
offense to something, and then that clouds your judgment for the rest of the
Right.
time,
Right.
right?
And I
And
get
then you
it. We're all human, but
yeah.
that shouldn't be as part of a hiring decision process, because if a candidate found out about that you were in a bad mood because you've heard something like that's irrelevant and then they've been overlooked, that's unfortunate. It's also not scalable. It's fine if you're an independent person or you're two people. Sure, you can make
Mhm,
telephone calls if you really insist on doing so, but that's not scalable. If you're an organization that's hiring hundreds of people a year,
mhm. It's true.
how can you keep the rigor and, you know, governance around that? Just talking about that right now, AI and telephone reference checks. There's various platforms right now. You can talk into this certain technologies for like 4 to 5 minutes. The AI will pick up the tone of voice, the way that you're speaking, your pauses, all of that good
Mhm.
stuff. And then your voice print is then replicated, copy paste, copy paste. So you then just put in a prompt,
Oh,
whatever the hell you
yeah.
want, into
Yes,
anything,
yes.
and the system will say it as if it was you. So if all I've got is the audio, well,
Yeah,
this sounds like this is James on the other end of the phone, but actually, it's a bot. It's not James.
yeah.
James is hopefully on a beach. Probably
Right.
not. Could be.
So I'm a consultant to small and medium-sized businesses, and I do all kinds of HR things for them. But a lot of my clients do not have an HRAS, let alone an ATS. Is there a way for those companies to access the technology of a reference check service without, the ATS or the HRIS? And for them, how much would it cost? Can you tell me?
Yes, I can, and yes they can, and yes I can. So first thing is, yes, you can do that. Like refapp.com, you can create an account. I think we have, I believe it's around about 40 to 45% of our global customer base do not have an ATS.
Oh,
So
see?
it is the majority. It is more than
Yeah.
half the people that use RefApp on a daily basis use it inside their, Lever, Greenhouse, Workday, Taleo, pick your favorite poison, right? Any of those guys. But but yeah, I'd say 40, 45% of people just use it just inside RefApp, refapp.com.
Right.
So you can do that. It's really simple. It's still, yeah, obviously all of your data is still safe. It's still secure in the cloud, so you can take it wherever you are. So if you're doing, your laptop, all that good stuff. So that's all great. In terms of cost, it's actually pretty low barrier to entry, right? So most organizations most reference checking organizations, and I know this very well, will try and lock you into some sort of contract. They'll say,
Hmm.
hey, sign up for 12 months or 24 or 36, and I'll take you out for a steak dinner if you pay me $1,000 for a startup fee or whatever, right? So there's lots of those types of things that are out there. I think it's really nice to work with an organization like RefApp is that believes in itself so much that they are month to month. So
Hmm.
pricing is literally just like, hey, you've got a very low price point, low
Hmm.
barrier to entry. You've put in that process and rigor and governance in place, but you're not spending fortunes of money, and I'm not committing to a contract. So if I get to the end of next month and say, hey, this isn't working for me anymore, cancel,
Hmm.
which is
Hmm.
nice.
We talked about this in a little bit in the last episode, but when in the process should we be doing reference checks? Before or after the final ish interview?
Yeah, I would say always before.
Right?
The vast majority of people have it post final interview,
Yes.
confirm their decisions, right?
Yeah.
So typically, a job offer literally says this on so many. Resumes say at the bottom of nearly every resume, references available upon request, right? And so often in most hiring processes, it's like your offer of employment is subject to satisfactory references. And
Yes.
that's the opportunity there again to communicate either verbally or in written form with the candidate. Hey, your offer of employment is subject to satisfactory references. We use a digital reference checking platform like RefApp. You'll receive an email, defined point in the process. Follow the links, like follow your nose. It's super simple. I personally advocate for pre-final interview because I think it gives us a lot of information to even talk about in interview.
Yes, it does.
Because The candidate nominates based on the criteria that we've specified for them. They nominate who the references are, but they can't see the references themselves. So they can't actually see. So the reference provider, or sometimes they're known as referees, the reference
Mhm,
provider can be candid and can go into
mhm,
as little detail as they feel comfortable with, because they've got the
mhm.
peace of mind that the candidate is not seeing this. I should press on that and just say that obviously under CCPA, GDPR, CASL, if the candidate requires, is adamant that they want to get a copy of that, then technically
Wow.
they can.
Okay, I wanted to know that.
I thought you were asking that question when you wrote it down,
Yeah, I
but
was going to.
I can't even see your paper. But yeah, I think that technically the candidate has got access to that because, of
Okay,
course, it's information about them.
yeah.
But typically, well, that's information that's yours, right? So, in nature of GDPR, CCPA, we've got two different kind of bodies in terms of we've got um, data provider. Oh, yeah, I forget what the actual legal term is now. Why am I blanking? What's the two terms? You've got data originator. You've got the people who own the data and the people that are processing the data, right? So
Mm,
the data is technically yours as the hiring
mm,
employer. So no
yeah.
reference check company should just be willingly giving that information.
Oh, okay.
Like,
Yeah,
if it's under
right.
lock and key, sure, it's kept with RefApp,
Yeah,
but that information is your
done.
information to share. So you have to
Right,
give consent to share it to the candidate. You have to give the
right,
provider consent.
right. So we've talked about technology tools and how they're helpful. How do you see AI changing how reference check companies do their work?
I think actually, it's kind of interesting because an easy way to stand out right now in the vendor HR technology space is to not talk about AI. It's
That's so
really,
funny. I've just recently recorded episodes around specifically almost around AI hype. Matt Alder, I talked to
yeah,
him about this exact topic, like how much is hype and how much isn't. And then I talked to Reese Akhtar about AI in talent management, and there just is so much hype. And so you're talking about distinguishing yourself by not talking about AI. But anyways, go ahead and talk about AI.
I think. Look, I mean, with like the recent, there's a big lawsuit going through right now. Don't need to name names, but who.
Workday.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That is um, going to be really interesting because the
Mhm.
outcome of that, I think, is already starting to shake and scare a lot of people.
Mm.
HR by nature, we are risk adverse people. We
Yes.
like risk. We
It's
don't
kind of
like,
we have to be. We're risk managers to some degree.
well, we're the gatekeepers of the organization,
Yeah.
right? We're the gatekeepers of the secrets of the organization as well. So
Mhm.
that's why it's so important that we avoid risk and we
Mhm.
calculate risk and we understand the risks that we are taking and we balance them with the outcomes as well.
Mhm.
I think with misrepresentation um, right now, which is so rife, and mass applications. Like there are vendors out there. I mean, I say vendors. Sure, you can spend money with someone else. You can go and build your own agent right now to go and
Mhm.
apply to 100 jobs with one click, and you can click for an hour.
Yeah.
So just think about the poor people who are on the receiving end of those inboxes. They're drinking from fire hydrants,
Yeah.
right? I mean, how can you do that? So it's almost kind of the pendulum swung back the other way. I was having this conversation with someone earlier this week. Like, I think probably up until really the last year, 2025 has changed because I've been in the reference checking space for, like I say, the last 10 years. When I first started, it was very novel. It was like, oh, wow, you can automate reference checks for me. I don't have to make telephone calls anymore. I can validate that that person is on the other end of the phone. I can save all this time and I can do some strategic succession planning or whatever else that other stuff that is that I want to get to that I can't, I've got occupied space in my mind. I can't get to the stuff I really want to do. Then for quite a while, it kind of went stale and people was like, oh, references are a waste of time. What's the point? We're only ever going to get, information from the candidate's friend's neighbor's cat or whatever, right? It's just like it's a waste of time. If they've come back into the spotlight a
Yeah.
lot because people are really wanting to dig into, do they actually have the skills, experience, and qualifications that they say they do? Because their
Mhm.
resume, this might even be a great human being, but their resume, I don't even know if they wrote it or if ChatGPT wrote it. And
Yeah.
then beyond that, like it might not even be them that's on this video interview. The reality is, unless we get people physically in the same room with like two different points of photo identification and we take their fingerprints, we're never really going to know who they are. So in an impractical world, where that is, what do we need to do in the meantime? We need to put as much risk mitigation in place as possible,
Mm.
and a thorough reference reference check tool that will cost you, you know, dollars, like literally nothing.
Yeah.
Like, what's the risk to hiring a wrong candidate? What organizational damage could they do? What could they steal? What could they, if you hire that bad apple, well, then the whole
Mhm.
bunch can potentially get contaminated, like with toxicity, and like, yeah, it's just not worth it. And that's like I said in the last episode. It's the risk of not doing references is way bigger than the risk of doing them.
Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts on how we measure internally if our reference check process is actually helping?
Yeah, good question. So the validity study that we're working on right now is going to provide a lot of data across a lot of different sectors, like from C-suite right down to manufacturing,
Mhm.
pickers, packers, delivery drivers on the warehouse floor, right? So we're going to see a really good variation of data across all of those different segments of the workforce.
Mhm.
But I think, one thing that's really interesting for us to do on an individual company level is for us to see, whether it's just like, okay, spot check, I'm just going to kind of just do a fill here. But of the candidates that you have hired and you did thorough reference checks for, are they successful employees?
Okay, final question here. We've probably talked more longer than we should have. Where could someone learn more about doing reference checks, about you, and probably about RefApp?
Yeah. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, James Lord on LinkedIn, james at refapp.com. We do
Mhm.
have quite a few resources on our website as well at refapp.com. If anyone has any specific questions or would like me to review a template or like, hey, this is what we're doing today, do you think that's good? I can't remember how many times I've looked at, this is a poor analogy, but one that will paint a visual, like people are dragging their cart with square wheels and then I can come along and say, hey, I can give you some round wheels.
Well, thanks, James. I love that. I'm thinking, like, honestly, that the next time I do some recruitment on behalf of a client, a small client without an ATS or HRES, that maybe I will reach out to a platform and employ a platform for doing it, just to make it easier and higher quality, honestly. We have reached the end of this episode, though. Thanks for listening up there. We'll catch you next time when I talk with another amazing guest.